Japan's air force didn't just lose the war, it was erased. Over 12,000 aircraft surrendered, thousands were destroyed, and for 7 years, not a single Japanese plane was allowed to fly. So what survived Japan's Air Force disarmament? Buried in the rubble is a different story, of hidden hangars, secret prototypes, and engineers who saved everything they could. This is how Japan's air power was dismantled piece by piece, and how it clawed its way back from zero. At first glance, Japan's 12,000 aircraft at surrender seemed like overwhelming proof of air power. But were those numbers really as threatening as they looked? 12,000 aircraft sounds like an air force that still has teeth, but that number only matters if you assume those planes were meant to come back. By 1945, that assumption was already dead. Thousands of those aircraft weren't part of a sustainable air force anymore. They were inventory for one-way missions. Japan had adapted over 7,500 planes for kamikaze operations, obsolete bombers that couldn't survive interception, trainers never meant for combat, emergency designs built fast and cheap because durability no longer mattered. When you're building aircraft that only need to fly once, the definition of operational changes completely. Japan wasn't preserving air power, it was spending it. Over 12,000 aircraft were reported at surrender, but thousands were obsolete, grounded, or prepped for suicide missions. You might assume an air force is useless without planes, but what happens when the planes are there and the pilots aren't? In Japan's case, the people failed before the machines did. Before the war, Japanese pilot training was among the most demanding in the world. Candidates faced brutal physical tests, academic requirements, and flying evaluations that could last years. The system produced elite aviators, men who could dogfight at night, navigate by stars, and land on carrier decks in rough seas. But it produced them slowly. There was excellence at the top, but no depth beneath. By 1945, Japan had lost over 10,000 experienced pilots. The Navy's carrier air groups had been decimated at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and later Gulf. The Army's veteran fighter pilots had been ground down in China, Burma, and New Guinea. The training pipeline couldn't keep up. Pre-war programs that took 2 years were compressed into months. Flight hours were slashed from 600 to under 100. Some kamikaze pilots received just enough training to take off and point their aircraft at a ship. Landing wasn't part of the curriculum anymore. The planes existed, the runways existed. But the system that turned aircraft into air power was already gone. By 1945, many kamikaze pilots had under 100 flight hours, and some barely knew how to land. Even with aircraft and pilots, Japan faced one more invisible enemy: its empty fuel tanks. What did a nation do when it could no longer afford to fly? It stopped. By 1945, American submarines had strangled Japan's oil supply routes from the Dutch East Indies. Tankers that once delivered crude to Japanese refineries now rested on the ocean floor. The few that made it through faced bombing raids that shattered refineries faster than they could be rebuilt. Transport networks collapsed under Allied attacks. The result was an air force frozen in place. Training flights were cancelled entirely. Operational sorties were rationed to the extreme, maybe one mission per week, maybe less. Engines were preserved instead of used, wrapped and stored like museum pieces. Thousands of planes weren't destroyed in combat. They were simply grounded by logistics. No fuel meant no training, no operations. Just thousands of planes sitting unused on runways and forest clearings. Japan didn't have one air force. It had two. So how did each collapse in its own way? And why does that matter? The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service operated separately. Different chains of command, different aircraft, different doctrines, and each collapsed differently. The Navy collapsed outward. Its early war dominance had been built on carrier-based air power, the strike force that hit Pearl Harbor, that ranged across the Pacific. But carrier battles are wars of attrition, and Japan lost badly. At Midway, 4 carriers and their air groups vanished in a single day. At the Philippine Sea, American fighters shredded Japanese formations so thoroughly the battle earned the nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Fuel shortages immobilized the remaining ships. The once mighty combined fleet spent its final months tied to docks. Unable to sortie, shore-based naval airfields became priority targets for Allied bombing. Concentrated, visible, easy to find. The army collapsed inward. It still had planes scattered across China, Manchuria, and the home islands. But most were outdated. Fixed-gear fighters that couldn't catch B-29, light bombers with insufficient range, reconnaissance aircraft serving as improvised attackers. Many were poorly maintained, cannibalized for parts, and an increasing number were locked into suicide roles. Late war designs showed Japanese engineers hadn't lost their edge. The Nakajima Ki-84 Frank matched American fighters in performance. The Kawasaki Ki-100 was considered one of the best fighters Japan ever produced. But they arrived too late, in too few numbers, flown by inexperienced pilots, burning fuel that didn't exist. The Navy lost its carriers and fuel first. The Army kept more aircraft, but most were outdated or assigned to kamikaze roles. As surrender neared, Japan couldn't fight, but it could still deceive. What was the plan behind scattering aircraft across the countryside? The final strategy wasn't victory, it was delay. Make the enemy believe the threat remained. Planes were rolled into forests and covered with camouflage nets, hidden in railway tunnels and mountain caves, concealed under civilian buildings and inside factories, dispersed across hundreds of remote airfields carved into rice paddies and forest clearings. The goal was survival on paper. If Allied reconnaissance couldn't find the planes, intelligence had to assume they were still operational, still dangerous, still waiting. Planes were hidden in forests, tunnels, and under buildings, a final deception that kept Allied forces cautious even after surrender. August 15, 1945. The Emperor speaks. The war is over. Or is it? Not everywhere. Not immediately. Some units ignored the order. Some never received it. Some refused to believe their emperor would actually surrender. The gap between announcement and compliance created a dangerous twilight period. On August 18th, 3 days after Hirohito's broadcast, 2 American B-32 Dominator bombers lifted off from Okinawa on a reconnaissance mission over Tokyo, verifying that Japanese air units were complying with the ceasefire by remaining grounded. The planes were unarmed except for defensive machine guns. The crews expected a quiet flight. They were wrong. At Yokosuka Naval Air Base, fighter pilots watched them pass overhead. For some, the sight was unbearable. Ace pilot Subaru Sakai was among them. He'd been flying combat missions since 1938, survived wounds that should have killed him. Orders said stay grounded. Instinct said otherwise. 17 fighters launched without authorization. 14 Mitsubishi, a 6 M0s, 3 Kawanishi N, 1 K2J, Shiden Kai fighters, some of Japan's best late-war aircraft. They climbed hard, positioning themselves above the bombers. Then they attacked. The B-32 crews had seconds to react. Gunners swung their 50 caliber machine guns toward the incoming fighters. The Japanese made repeated passes, 20mm cannons hammering the bombers. One B-32 took concentrated fire. Cannon rounds punched through the fuselage, knocked out an engine, shredded control surfaces. Inside, Sergeant Anthony Marchioni, a 19-year-old photographer from Pottstown, Pennsylvania, was hit by 20mm cannon fire in the chest. 30 minutes later, as the damaged bomber struggled back toward Okinawa, Marchioni died in his crewmate's arms. 3 days after Hirohito's speech, Japanese fighters attacked US bombers, killing 1 airman in the war's final dogfight. Both B-32 made it back. The next day, propellers were removed from Japanese aircraft as part of the surrender enforcement. Even during the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, Allied combat air patrols remained overhead. The war ended legally, but in practice, it had sputtered out over weeks. Then came silence. 7 years of it. What happens when a country goes from thousands of planes to 0 overnight? What does a total aviation ban even look like? Complete shutdown. From 1945 to 1952, Japan wasn't allowed to fly any plane, train any pilot, or build anything that could leave the ground. The ban was absolute. Military aircraft, civilian airlines, pilot training, manufacturing, research, even gliders. Airfields were seized by occupation forces. Factories were dismantled. Flight itself became illegal. Allied policy targeted machines, not just territory. The Potsdam Declaration had been clear. Complete disarmament, elimination of war-making capacity, occupation until these terms were fulfilled. Aviation fell squarely in the crosshairs. By the final year of the war, The Allies weren't just targeting aircraft. They were targeting the very idea of flight in Japan. What do you do with thousands of enemy planes after victory? The Allies had one answer: make sure they never fly again. Allied technical intelligence teams fanned across Japan, cataloguing every aircraft, every factory, every piece of aviation equipment. Approximately 145 complete aircraft were crated and sent to the United States for evaluation. The rest faced a simpler fate. Aircraft were burned where they sat, flames consuming fabric-covered wings and wooden structures. They were crushed by bulldozers, reduced to unrecognizable heaps. They were broken apart, wings severed, fuselages sectioned. Many were simply pushed into the sea, long lines of aircraft shoved off piers or dumped offshore. The few aircraft permitted to fly during the surrender process received special markings: white paint covering the entire airframe, large green crosses on wings and fuselage. Not mercy markings. Control markings. Aircraft were burned, scrapped, or pushed into the sea. Those used for surrender were painted white with green crosses to avoid being shot down. So what actually made it through? Which aircraft escaped total erasure, and why were they spared? A few survived through luck, secrecy, or deliberate capture for study. The Aichi M6A1 Seiran might be the most radical. The name means clear sky storm, and it was designed for a mission that sounds like science fiction, launching from submarines to bomb the Panama Canal. Japan had built the largest submarines in the world specifically to carry these aircraft. The I-400 class, 400 feet long, capable of circling the globe 1.5 times without refueling. Each submarine carried 3 Seirans in a watertight hangar. The aircraft's wings folded, tail surfaces hinged downward, and the entire plane compressed to fit inside an 11.5-foot diameter tube. A well-trained crew could launch one in 7 minutes. Only 28 Seirans were ever built. The mission never happened. On August 16, 1945, as the submarine flotilla sailed toward their target, they received word of Japan's surrender. All 6 Seirans aboard were pushed overboard to avoid capture, but the Americans found one at the Aichi aircraft factory in August 1945, the last Seiran ever built, serial number 28. After an 11-year restoration, it now sits at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center, the only surviving example in the world. Quick pause if you're finding this interesting. A like makes a real difference. Anyway, moving forward. Another survivor, the Kyushu J-7W Shinden, Magnificent Lightning, Japan's attempt to build an interceptor that could catch B-29. Its design was radical. A canard configuration with small forewings at the nose, main wings at the rear, and a pusher propeller behind the cockpit. It looked like it was flying backward. The layout placed the pilot forward with excellent visibility and put 430mm cannons in the nose. But time ran out. The first prototype didn't fly until August 3rd, 1945. Test pilot Captain Tsuruno made 3 short flights, total time 45 minutes. Then the war ended. 2 prototypes were completed. One was scrapped. The other was claimed by US Navy intelligence, dismantled, and shipped to America. It sits now at the Udvar-Hazy Center next to the Seiran. Submarine bombers, radical prototypes, and late warfighters escaped total erasure, most because the Allies wanted to study them. Aircraft can be crushed, but knowledge? That's harder to destroy. What happened to the people behind Japan's aviation boom? When the occupation forces dismantled Japan's aviation industry, they destroyed machines and closed factories. But they couldn't eliminate the thousands of engineers, designers, and skilled workers who had built one of the world's most sophisticated air forces. Many pivoted to civilian industries: automobiles, motorcycles, tools, appliances. The expertise that had built aircraft engines went into building car engines. The knowledge of aerodynamics translated into vehicle design. Nakajima Aircraft Company had been one of Japan's 2 largest aviation manufacturers. After the war, occupation authorities ordered it dissolved. In 1950, anti-zaibatsu legislation formally broke the company into 12 separate entities, but the pieces didn't disappear. In 1953, 5 of those companies merged to form Fuji Heavy Industries. Their first products weren't aircraft, that was still banned. They were motor scooters, called the Fuji Rabbit, assembled from leftover aircraft parts. The scooters sold well in a nation desperate for cheap transportation. Then came automobiles. The Subaru 1500 in 1954, followed by the Subaru 360 in 1958, Japan's first mass-produced car. These weren't just cars with airplane company badges. They carried aviation DNA, horizontally opposed boxer engines, lightweight construction, emphasis on balance and handling. When the aviation ban lifted in 1952, Fuji Heavy Industries was ready. They started with training aircraft, then helicopters, then components for commercial aircraft. Today, as Subaru Corporation, they still manufacture aircraft parts, including center wing sections for Boeing 777s and 787s. Designers from dismantled companies pivoted to cars, tools, and appliances, and quietly preserved aviation knowledge in the process. By the 1950s, global politics had changed. Japan needed planes again, but couldn't call it an air force. So what rose in its place? The Cold War was heating up. The Korean War had started in 1950, bringing combat to Japan's doorstep. The United States needed regional allies, and Japan, demilitarized, constitutionally prohibited from having a military, suddenly needed to defend itself again. But the solution couldn't look like the problem. Japan couldn't have an army, navy, or air force. Not officially. On July 1st, 1954, the Japan Air Self-Defense Force was created. Not an air force, a self-defense force. Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited war-making capacity. The workaround was careful. These weren't offensive forces, they were defensive forces. In 1954, the Japan Air Self-Defense Force was born. No air force, just defense. Staffed by former pilots, trained under US eyes. In January 1955, the US Air Force formally turned over 85 aircraft to the JASDF. All American types, F-86, Sabre fighters, T-6 trainers, C-46 transports. Former Imperial pilots were recruited, but selectively screened. Some had been aces during the war. Now they'd fly American aircraft under American oversight. Training resumed under strict supervision. Doctrine, procedures, even language. English became required for aviation communication. The JASDF started small, but it grew. Licensed production of American fighters gave Japanese industry practice. Eventually came domestic designs. Today, the JASDF operates over 700 aircraft, including some of the most advanced fighters in the world. Imperial Japan's air power didn't fade away. It was counted, catalogued, destroyed, and legally erased. For 7 years, the sky was closed. Factories became parking lots. Engineers built scooters. Pilots became salarymen. Yet the knowledge endured. When the world changed enough to permit it, Japan's aviation industry rebuilt from those hidden foundations. Today, modern aircraft fly where wooden hangars once burned, not as tools of conquest, but defense. Subaru builds cars and aircraft components in factories that once produced fighters. The Smithsonian displays the Seiran and Shinden as artifacts of impossible innovation. Japan's air force was erased, but not forgotten, and in that gap between destruction and survival lies one of the most complete demilitarization stories in modern history. That's all I got for this one. If you're still with me, like and subscribe would mean a ton. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next video.